Grab your favorite beverage. It's time for the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what's up? This is part one of week 14's Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. We will be breaking down the 9 NFC home games, starting with the Thursday night game, Cowboys at the Bears. I'm going to try and keep this kind of a short podcast. I'm feeling a little under the weather today. I feel like I'm cheating. It's the first episode of the podcast that I'm not drinking a beer while I'm doing it. So, we're going to start Cowboys-Bears, and we're going to get into the 4 NFC division games. There's one from each NFC division this week. Got a couple other games, and then we're going to finish up with the 2 AFC visiting NFC games. So we got 3 weeks left in the fantasy season. This is either your first week of the playoffs or it's your last week of the regular season. So let's get into it. Let's hopefully win some leagues here. So we got the Cowboys at the Bears. Cowboys -3. It's a 43-point over-under right now. I'm going to take the Cowboys -3 in the first leg of my NFC home game FanDuel parlay. I just think the Cowboys, they've lost a couple games in a row now. They really should have beat the Bills on Thanksgiving, but they did not. And I think the Cowboys are going to go in and hopefully let Zeke run wild. I was honestly kind of amazed at how little work Zeke got on Thursday night, but I'm going to start with Amari Cooper with a nice little bounce-back game after getting shut out by Stephon Gilmore. He caught 8 of his 11 targets for 85 yards. Honestly, I thought he was going to get not shut out again, but I didn't think he was going to play this well because I figured he'd see a lot of Tre'Davious White, but the Cowboys really moved him around, and they were able to get him going early in the game. So good game for Amari. Should help you out with your confidence as far as starting him this week against the Bears. But the Cowboys really, their offense had no rhythm. Dak Prescott should not be throwing the ball this much. 49 attempts last week. There's absolutely no reason to me why Ezekiel Elliott only gets 12 carries. Yes, he was very much involved in the pass game, but 12 carries is just ridiculous. He had the fewest carries for Ezekiel since week 2 of 2017, and this was against a Bills run defense that has been beat up by a few running backs this season. If you look back, week 2, Saquon had over 100 and a touchdown. In week 5, they were able to keep Derrick Henry to 78 yards, but he also scored. Week 7, even freaking Mark Walton with the Dolphins had 66 yards on 14 carries. Week 8, both of the Eagle running backs had a touchdown. Jordan Howard with 96 yards, Miles Sanders with 74. Week 9, we saw Adrian Peterson, Mr. 34, I think he is. Ran for over 100 on 18 carries, and then in week 10, Nick Chubb had over 100 yards as well. So very, very surprising to me how little they used Zeke and how little they ran the ball, period. I mean, they only had 15 carries by the running backs total. So I think they're going to look at that, and they're going to look at this Bears defense, and they're going to say, we gotta get our big guy going. So that's why I like the Cowboys this week. Looking at the Bears, I'm kind of stunned that Trubisky threw as much as he did as well. Both of these guys were throwing the ball a lot on Thanksgiving. The Lions have one of the worst run defenses, and the Bears run it 19 times, 4 less attempts than their average per game. But Mitch put up some numbers, his first 300-plus passing yard game this year. Anthony Miller has been very involved lately, averaging 7 catches and 11 targets over the past 3 games. So he's been playing really well. Allen Robinson is still the top dog there, at least 6 catches and 86 yards in 3 of his last 4 games. So we're starting to see some consistency from this passing offense. The Cowboys have been pretty tough on wide receivers, though, but we just saw them allow over 100 and a touchdown to Cole Beasley in a revenge game for Cole Beasley, in which he played really good. So, maybe that gives you a little confidence in playing these two guys. If the Bears are going to continue to ask Trubisky to throw the ball 38 times a game, and these two wide receivers continue to see a 30 to 35% target share, then I think they're both worth playing, especially in PPR leagues. If you're still holding out hope on Tariq Cohen, you can definitely drop him now. David Montgomery's touchdown came on a red zone target, so if Cohen is going to be losing out on those touches, he's going to be completely worthless to us in fantasy football. Moving on to the Seahawks at the Rams here. So I'm surprised how much the Seahawks ran the ball against the Vikings defense that ranks 5th against the run. Russell Wilson threw exactly his average attempts per game at 31, yet they ran the ball 12 more times than they have per game this year. No team had rushed for over 147 yards versus the Vikings this season. Last week, Seattle ran for over 200. So just another example of how the Seahawks don't really care what you do well. They don't really care if your defense is good against the run. They're going to do what they do well, and that's run the ball down your throat. I think both Seattle running backs are worth playing. Last week I kind of broke down the touches between the two of them, and they're both getting work, and they're both putting up good numbers. So I'm going to play both of them. I think it's only a matter of time until DK Metcalf becomes the number 1 wide receiver in Seattle, if he's not there already with the Tyler Lockett injury, or with him being sick last week. He had no catches on 3 targets, while DK led the team in receiving. So he's definitely come on from the middle of the season. It's kind of strange. Very rarely do we see rookie wide receivers come in and have such a big impact on a team's passing game, but DK Metcalf has clearly done that. Lockett, David Moore, and DK Metcalf all scored when these two teams played in Week 5, so I think Metcalf and Lockett are both safe plays. Will Dissly led the team in receiving in Week 5 when they played, and with him gone on IR, Jacob Hollister is seeing the most targets. He saw the most targets on the team last week, so Hollister could be a cheap, nice, solid FanDuel tight end at $5,500. That's a great deal. So it might be somebody you look at on FanDuel right there. As far as the Rams go, so this is a 46.5 point over-under. I think the last time they played these two teams, it was a 61 point total. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this over-under here. After being embarrassed by the Ravens 2 weeks ago, the Rams returned the favor by beating up on the Cardinals for over 550 total yards of offense. Gurley with his third 100-plus total yard game, but only 1 target in the game. The Seahawks' run D is 8th best. They held Gurley to only 3.5 yards per carry in Week 5 when they played. If you've got into the playoffs with Gurley as your number 2 running back or one of your flexes, then you're probably stuck playing him this week. I doubt your waiver wire has any viable options. So fire him up again and hope for the best. 20 or more touches in 2 of the last 3 games, which is encouraging for Todd Gurley and his owners, so he should be okay. Robert Woods with 172 of Jared Goff's 424 passing yards last week. He had 19 targets, more than double that of the next highest target getter, Tyler Higbee, who took advantage of the best matchup in fantasy football last week, tight ends against Arizona. He had over 100 yards and a touchdown on a fake field goal. He has another great matchup this week against the Seahawks, who allow the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends. So I think he's another great cheap tight end that you can throw into your FanDuel lineup or even stream in your seasonal league. So keep an eye on these tight ends, man. They can really make a difference. Cooper Kupp had 117 yards and a touchdown on his 17 targets. versus the Seahawks in Week 5. So I'm starting all three of these guys this week: Woods, Higbee, Kupp. I am staying away from Brandon Cooks because his involvement has pretty much disintegrated over these past 2 weeks since he's returned from his concussion issues. Next, we got the first of our four, this is the second of the 4 division games here. Panthers at the Falcons. Panthers +3, 47-point over-under right now. Just to show how good McCaffrey has been all year, last week he had 102 total yards with 7 catches, and it was his second worst game of the year. The most disappointing 13.5 fantasy point performance ever. He's just absolutely awesome, and he's going to be totally fine. Don't read into it too much. Just because he didn't have a touchdown doesn't mean you got to freak out. But both Panther wide receivers did have a touchdown last week. DJ Moore continues his streak of 5 games now with at least 13.5 fantasy points. Curtis Samuels continues to see fewer targets than DJ Moore, but he's getting the red zone targets. First red zone target of the game went to Samuels last week, so it seems like their roles are kind of solidified now. Greg Olsen is in concussion protocol, so we'll see if he's going to play. If not, even more targets for Moore, Samuel, and McCaffrey. I'm not sure if there's really a team in the NFL that concentrates all of their touches on, on 3 guys, maybe 4 if Greg Olsen is involved. But it's pretty much just these 3 dudes, and you can totally play them every week for sure. Sorry about that. Devontae Freeman with only 64 yards on 21 touches last week. If there's ever a week to play Freeman, it's this week. The Panthers are incredibly bad against running backs. They allow the most fantasy points to running backs, especially on the road. We'll have to see if Julio practices this week. If he misses this game, Ridley and Russell Gage are both in play. Gage with 19 targets over the last 2 games. He's been playing really well. And Ridley, the last time that these 2 teams played in Week 11, he had 143 yards on 8 catches and a touchdown. So he's also very safe play. Yes, Matt Ryan had his 8th 300-plus passing yard game last week, but from the 6.5 minute mark in the fourth quarter, down 26-9, Matt Ryan had 124 yards and one of his touchdowns in what is classic garbage time. He had almost half of his passing yards in that last 6 minutes of the game. He also was sacked 5 times, which in the fourth quarter, which kind of just shows how bad the Falcon offensive line really is. So I wouldn't read too much into Matt Ryan's performance last week, but the Panthers are not really all that great, so I don't see why you can't play him again this week as well. All right, we got the Giants at the Eagles. Interesting thing here is that apparently Daniel Jones is dealing with a ankle or a foot injury, and there's some serious talk about Eli possibly starting this game. It is a 45.5 point over-under. Giants are getting 9.5 points, and to me, anytime you see 9.5 points in a division game, it's pretty attractive to me. I don't think there's too many division games that are really all that much of a blowout, except for the Chiefs-Raiders game last week. But yeah, I think I might be inclined to take those 9.5 points. Eagles secondary. The Dolphins just ripped them up last week. Yes, I said the Dolphins ripped you up. So I think the Giants can do things, especially if they get Golden Tate back. They'll be, as close to 100% as they've been all year. Sterling Shepard gets a touchdown with no Golden Tate last week, but if Tate is missing this game, which actually is a revenge game for Golden Tate after spending half the year in Philadelphia last year, then Shepard should be good again versus the Eagles, who allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers. So honestly, I don't know whether Tate plays or not. I think Sterling Shepard's a solid play, but I thought we'd see Saquon Barkley's touches go down with his nagging injuries, shoulder, ankle, knee. I think he's had all kinds of stuff going on, and with the Giants' record. But last week he tied his most carries of the season with 19. It was a snow game, which usually in bad weather games, you try and lean on your running game a little bit more, which makes sense. But the Packers didn't have a problem airing it out. He had over 100 total yards and a touchdown. He's still a must start, even versus this really tough Eagles run defense. I'm guessing he'll see a lot of work in the passing game. Saquon had 20 targets in his 2 games versus the Eagles last year. They haven't played each other yet this year, so I think you'll see Saquon very much used screens and splitting them out and all kinds of stuff. So keep that in mind. With Evan Ingram and Rhett Allison both out last week, Caden Smith played really well. He led the team in yards, second on the team in targets. But the Eagles are pretty good against tight ends too. So Evan Ingram is the only Giants tight end worth playing, in my opinion. Even if Ingram and Ellison miss again, I don't think I'd really feel all that great about playing Caden Smith again. Looking at the Eagles here, so I think Miles Sanders has kind of won the starting RB spot in Philadelphia. In his 3 games as the starter, he hasn't really looked all that bad. He struggled against the Patriots, as most rookies do, but he had over 80 total yards in Week 12, and then over 100 and a touchdown in Week 13. So if Howard misses again, Sanders should be a pretty good play versus the Giants. Alshon Jeffrey returned, and he saw the most targets he's seen since 2015. He caught 9 of his 16 targets for 137 yards and a touchdown in his first game since Week 9. As long as he's healthy, he's a great play against the second-best matchup for wide receivers. He had a 34% target share on a team that throws 35-plus times a game. Against a terrible defense, Jeffrey should be an absolute monster. Disappointing game for Zach Ertz last week. He only caught half of his targets. He had his 3 best games of the year between weeks 9 and 12. Then week 13, he had his second worst game of the year. His involvement in the offense was huge in those 3 games, 12 targets a game and 2 touchdowns over that span. Then he kind of disappeared, kind of a microcosm of his season. He's been pretty inconsistent this year besides the 3-game stretch. Besides that 3-game stretch that he had the 12 targets and the 2 touchdowns. Goddard has exactly half the targets that Ertz does this year, which may not seem like a lot, but it has been enough to kind of hurt Ertz. Surprisingly, the Giants allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, but they've seen only the 3rd fewest targets to tight ends, probably because every team is able to do whatever they want in the passing game with their wide receivers. And they really haven't faced a dominant tight end yet this season, let alone 2 of them like the Eagles have. So looking at what tight ends the Giants have faced, in Week 1 they gave up a touchdown to Witten. Week 3 against O.J. Howard, 66 yards. Kyle Rudolph only had 1 target in Week 5, and that's because Stephon Diggs had over 100 yards. Dalvin Cook had 80 yards receiving. You look at Week 8, T.J. Hawkinson with only 1 target. Why? Because Kenny Galladay had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. Danny Amendola had almost 100 yards. When Dallas played New York again, Witten had 58 yards on 8 catches. Week 10, the tight ends of the Jets, Herndon and Griffin, were only targeted 3 times. Week 13, Jimmy Graham 1 target. Mercedes Lewis had a touchdown on his only target. Same thing again. You look, Devontae Adams had 2 touchdowns in that game, and Alan Lazard had over 100 yards and a touchdown as well. So they really haven't faced any good tight ends this season. So I don't know how much weight that ranking really has as far as them being ranked 5th against tight ends. So I don't think you should really be nervous at all about playing either of the Eagle tight ends, and especially with this offense being what it is right now, it's pretty much Alshon Jeffrey and the 2 tight ends, and that's pretty much it. I mean, we did see Miles Sanders get 5 targets last week, and he caught all 5 of them, including a touchdown catch. So maybe he sees a little more involvement in the passing game as well, but for the most part, it's those 2 tight ends. All right, looking at the Lions at the Vikings. So I don't know who's going to start at quarterback for the Lions, but whoever it is, they're going to be looking at Marvin Jones a lot. Jones had 4 touchdowns on 13 targets when they played in Week 7. Stafford was the starting quarterback then, and I don't really know if these other QBs are capable of putting up 4 touchdowns, let alone to one guy, but we'll have to keep an eye on that. Danny Amendola also had a big game with 8 catches and 11 targets on with 105 yards against the Vikings in Week 7. Last week, Danny Amendola had 8 targets, so he has become more involved, and he was very involved the last time they played. He should be a good play in PPR leagues at least. I know the Seahawks just put up big numbers in the run game last week, but Bo Scarborough has been playing well lately since taking over in Detroit. He's had a touchdown or 80 yards in all 3 of his games as the starter. But I'm not playing him this week. The Lions are not the Seahawks. The Lions' run game is nothing like the Seahawks' run game, so I'm sitting Bo Scarborough. As far as the Vikings go, the Vikings are starting to kind of fall apart here. They were already without Adam Thielen last week, and then Stephon Diggs and Dalvin Cook both left Monday's game early with injuries. Stephon Diggs was able to return, so he should be fine this week. He's just, I think he just kind of rolled his ankle. Somebody stepped on him. And Dalvin Cook says that he's fine and he will play versus the Lions, but we'll have to see about that. If you have Dalvin Cook like I do in one league, this is why you handcuff your top running backs, because if he does miss, Alexander Mattison should be an absolute monster. If Cook does play, there's no way that head coach Mike Zimmer lets him touch the ball 23 times like he has on average every game this year. I think no matter what, we're going to be looking at best case 50-50 split in this game, which in this matchup really shouldn't matter because the Lions give up the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs, so they should both be fine. And if Cook does miss, if they decide, you know what, we're just going to sit you and let the rookie get all the touches, like I said, he should be an absolute monster. I actually added him in one of my leagues solely because if Cook doesn't play, then I think Mattson's going to be one of the best running backs this week. So, all right, this game should be awesome. We got the 49ers at the Saints. If you go back and you listen to what I said last week, I said with Breida out, Mostert is going to be worth a play. And he played great. I think he's the best San Francisco running back, but Shanahan is not going to commit to just one guy. That's not how he runs his offense. I think Mostert has looked the best between the 3 San Francisco running backs. Really, if you want to count Jeff Wilson between all 4 of them, I wouldn't be surprised if he had the best game. But with all 3 of the main running backs healthy, I don't know how you can start any one of them really against this 4th-ranked Saints run defense. Their pass defense is not all that great. The run defense is really the strength of that team. Looking at Deebo Samuels, he's had a wildly inconsistent but very much productive past 4 games. Weeks 10 and 11, Deebo saw 10 targets, had 8 catches in each game for 112 yards, then 134 yards. And then in weeks 12 and 13, he saw only 6 targets and 4 catches combined for under 100 yards, but he had the 2 touchdowns. So he's been productive. He's just been extremely inconsistent. I don't know what they're doing. What would make a guy see double-digit targets back-to-back games and then only see 6 targets in the 2 combined in the next 2 games? Very weird. The Saints' pass defense is not great. They're allowing the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks and wide receivers. So if you've been riding the Deebo train, then I think you can stay aboard the train. I think you should be okay this week. I think it's pretty obvious that Emmanuel Sanders is still kind of healing up from that rib injury that he had. Looking at the Saints, so this is a 44.5-point over-under, and the 49ers are getting 2.5 points going down into New Orleans. This might be the best defense that the Saints see all year. They don't really have a weakness, so I don't really see a particular spot that they'll attack. Kamara and Thomas will dominate touches like they always do. The 49ers are the best at defending tight ends, so I don't really think you can count on Jared Cook, who's actually been playing really well lately as well, 74 or more yards in 3 of his last 4 games, including 2 touchdowns in those games. So Hopefully Taysom Hill doesn't vulture any more touchdowns like he did last week when he ran one in from like 20 yards out on what you would consider a wildcat snap, but it's not a wildcat when your backup quarterback you're the fastest player on your team. Then he caught a 3-yard touchdown, stealing a red zone target from Michael Thomas. He also blocked a punt. He's incredible, man. He's got to be the most used backup quarterback of all time. I can't wait for Breeze to retire so I can draft Taysom Hill. I think he's the next Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen. I think when he does finally get his opportunity to start, he's going to light it up. It's definitely going to be exciting there. Looking to our next game here, we got the Redskins at the Packers. So Darius Geis should have won the starting running back job in Washington. If you go back and you look at their game log, so Peterson had the first carry for no gain. In Geis's first carry, he broke away for 60 yards and finished the drive with another 8 receiving yards on 2 catches. They ended up kicking a field goal on that drive, but after a turnover in the second quarter, Geis converted a goal line carry for a touchdown. Then in the fourth quarter, down 6, Geis finishes off a 7-play drive by converting a second goal line carry for his second touchdown. He had 5 touches on the drive for 62 of the 69 yards in that game-winning drive. So Adrian Peterson still finished with more carries because he had 30 of his 99 yards on his touchdown in the end of the game while killing the clock. I'm kind of hoping that we see this run game continue to build and start swaying more towards Geis. Kind of looks like a poor man's version of the Frank Gore, Devin Singletary situation here. I really like Geis. I added him in a couple of my leagues. With him returning, I figured on a team that really has nothing to play for and on a team that they spent some high draft capital on Darius Geis 2 years ago, and Adrian Peterson's only getting older, so it's not like he's a big part of their future either. So I fully expect to see Darius Geis to continue to play well and to continue to get more touches. The Packers actually allow the 5th most fantasy points to running backs, so he's got a great matchup here as well. Looking at the Packers, so Aaron Jones may have lost his control of the starting role in the run game there, or at least lost the lead role. Besides his 93 yard week in Week 10 versus the Panthers, who are absolutely terrible against the run. Every team is dominating the Panthers, including the aforementioned Redskins. Aaron Jones has just 2.5 yards per carry on 32 carries since that. Besides that Panthers game. So in those same 3 games, Jamal Williams has averaged 4.9 yards per touch because he's so much more involved in the pass game. So I think we're looking at a split in carries and probably continue to see Jamal Williams perform better in the passing game. It seems like they're just not really all that confident in Aaron Jones going forward. He's just he's kind of hit a rough spot here. So we'll see how the Packers decide to divvy up their running back touches going forward. All right. Oops. What's going on here? Lovely technology. All right. Moving on to the Steelers at the Cardinals. Steelers minus 2.5. The over-under is 43.5. And I think I'm going to take the under on this game. 2 offenses that they haven't really put up any big numbers yet. I think the most points that the Cardinals have scored was 27, and the Steelers are usually humming right around between 22 and 25 points a game. So under 43.5, I'm going to take that. This is a Super Bowl 43 rematch. It's kind of number 43s everywhere. So Benny Snell is driving the late season surprise fantasy running back train, back-to-back weeks with double-digit fantasy points, 17 or more touches in 3 of the last 4 games. As long as James Conner is out, Snell is definitely a start. The Cardinals allow the 10th most fantasy points to running backs and the 4th most receiving yards to running backs. But James Conner was able to practice today, albeit in a limited fashion, so I would imagine that he's going to suit up for this game, which is definitely going to hurt Benny Snell. But like I said, if Connor misses, then Snell is a definite start. James Washington has been playing really well alongside Snell over these last 4 games. 3 of the last 4 with 90 or more yards and a touchdown. In the last 4 games, Washington leads the Steelers in targets, catches, yards. No one in the league has a higher ADOT with as many targets as James Washington in the last 4 games. So no one is seeing as many targets as with as a higher average depth per target, which is what ADOT stands for, than James Washington. So he's been killing it, man. And the Cardinals against wide receivers, they give up the 5th most to the position. They're giving up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So this is a great matchup. It's also a really good matchup for the tight ends. It's actually the best matchup in fantasy football is tight ends against the Cardinals, and Vance McDonald is the lucky man this week. So we'll see. I'm going to guess that he's going to be a big part of the passing game and the game plan this week. Vance McDonald saw 3 targets last week. I expect him to see a lot more than that this week. And then looking at the Cardinals, David Johnson with only 6 touches for 24 yards. He was apparently 100% going into this week. Drake has clearly become the number 1. It's over for David Johnson, at least this year. The Rams held the Cardinal running backs to 29 receiving yards on 4 catches of 7 targets. The Steelers versus pass-catching running backs, actually they allow the 6th most receiving yards to running backs. So maybe Kenyon Drake can get back on track, because throwing the ball to the running backs is something that the Cardinals do a lot of. In fact, I think their running backs have the highest target share of the position in the league. The Steelers just held Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham Jr. to 9 catches on 17 targets for about 100 total yards. And Fitz and Kirk are not Landry and OBJ, so I'm not expecting much of anything from these Cardinal wide receivers, really, which is another reason why I'm pretty confident in this under here. I just don't really think the Cardinals are going to do anything on offense, and I think the Steelers are going to be completely content with playing a conservative game, relying on their run game and their defense, and not asking Duck Hodges to really do much. He only completed 14 passes last week, so I like that under 43.5. All right, and looking at the last NFC home game here of the week, Jonathan Williams only had 9 touches last week after having over 100 yards in both of his previous games, but he struggled early. He had 3 yards on his first 6 first quarter carries. Williams had 10 of his 14 yards on 1 carry. Wilkins had 15 yards on his first carry in the second quarter. Naheem Hines had 14 yards on his first carry in the second quarter. So, and Williams didn't see a touch for the rest of the game. They kind of just got away from him. And Marlon Mack might be returning this week from his hand injury. So I think Jonathan Williams I think he's kind of done. The Bucs' run defense is actually really good. They're allowing the second fewest fantasy points to running backs. But if Marlon Mack if Marlon Mack starts, then I'm definitely going to flex him. Again, this is one of the teams that wants to run the ball. They have an awesome, dominating offensive line, and they want to ride those guys. As far as the Colt passing game, Jack Doyle and Zach Pascal saw half of all the targets on the team. Both had double-digit targets. Doyle had 73 yards and a touchdown. Pascal had over 100 on his 7 catches. There are rumors that T.Y. Hilton might be shut down for the season, and with Chester Rogers is on IR now, Pascal has become the number 1 wide receiver there. With Eric Ebron also on IR, Jack Doyle has proven that he can be a reliable, high-volume receiver. So both Doyle and Pascal have great matchups. The Bucs allow the most fantasy points to wide receivers and the second most fantasy points to tight ends. So another great matchup for Jack Doyle. I will definitely be putting together an anytime touchdown parlay ticket, and Jack Doyle is going to be on there. Jameis Winston with a fumble last week, but no interceptions. It's only his 4th game this season without an interception, which is pretty wild when you consider they've played 12 games now. And So Bruce Arians, he was the offensive coordinator with the Colts, and then when their head coach got sick, he became the head coach. This was before he went out to Arizona, and he already played Arizona this week, but he gets another
revenge.
A second revenge game of the season here for Bruce Arians. Ronald Jones was benched in this game last week. Apparently he missed a blitz pickup, and Peyton Barber kind of took over. He saw 70% of the carries, including a second and goal from the 1, plus a 2-point conversion carry. So he saw all of the goal line work. The Colts have a top 6 defense against running backs, so I cut Ronald Jones in one of my leagues because I just can't trust him. Mike Evans has been somewhat struggling lately. 4 straight games with only 4 catches, despite seeing 11 targets last week. I have Mike Evans in a non-PPR league, and I'm still playing him. I do have the playoff spot locked up, so it's not a must-win situation. But with the playoffs starting next week, I'm beginning to get a little concerned about Mike Evans. Then again, the first week of the playoffs in Week 15, he gets the Lions, so he hopefully should be just fine against the Lions, who are absolutely atrocious on defense. So that's going to do it for the podcast. Those were all the NFC home games. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're either getting into the playoffs or you're already in. So make sure you tune in tomorrow or the next day. I'm not sure which day I'm going to release it. For the AFC home games, there's another 7 of those to go through. And as always, may the fantasy gals be cool to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. For more episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Beers and Bruisers is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach TV, or your favorite podcast service. Beers and Bruisers is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com or download the free HC Universal Network app today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gaming operates a national problem gambling helpline network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to drink responsibly and always look for your man downfield.